Welcome to the Wisdom Seat Podcast. I'm Bill Moriarty. Today's guest is Larry Mermelstein, a close student of Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche since 1971, founding member and executive director of the Nalanda Translation Committee, and a senior teacher in the Vajradhatu Shambhala community. This interview was conducted in person by Joanna Rote before a live audience at Sky Lake Shambhala Meditation Retreat Center in Rosendale, New York. Here's Joanna and Larry.
So this is the first in a series of open houses at Sky Lake. And we have a very special guest tonight, all the way from Halifax, Nova Scotia, by way of Tucson, Arizona, by way of New Jersey, by way of Menla, and by way of Stone Ridge here to Sky Lake. And his name is Larry Mermelstein. And Larry is a long-time student of Trungpa Rinpoche, who is the founder, as you know, of Shambhala. And he has lots of stories. So we're going to do this as a kind of conversation. Larry brought some newsletters. He is the president and director. He's not a president, he's a director of Nalanda Translation Committee, and this is their quarterly?
Annual.
Once a year.
Oh, but I tell you, if we had to do it more than that, I don't think we'd survive.
This is the annual.
That's a lot of work.
And it's very, very enjoyable, in fact, to read. So, I thought we might start out by asking you how it began for you, the sort of origin story of your relationship with Trungpa Rinpoche, and take us back there when it began.
Well, for me.
For you, personally.
I'm not where he began.
No, that we could hear that too, but let's go with how you met Trungpa Rinpoche and what drew you to him.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so this is about me, not so much about Trungpa Rinpoche, but there are many people like me who probably have very similar stories. I was in college, about midway through college. I early in college became a student of Swami Satchidananda. Yoga was a big thing. Eastern religions were a big thing. I think in high school, I read about Zen, Alan Watts, D.T. Suzuki, things like that, was very inspiring. I wound up being a yoga student and practitioner, and my roommate, who a couple of you know, Ron Stubbert, was my college roommate, and Ron lived in England during his middle school years. And his father was the head of a big Ford tractor plant. And we thought, well, let's go to England for the summer. And Ron's father got us jobs. And there were two things that I had in my mind that I wanted to do in going to England. I mean, there were a lot of things that I was hoping to experience, but I really wanted to go to Stonehenge, which had been a kind of boyhood obsession of sorts. You know, there were not a lot of books that were of any profundity in this era. You know, that we're talking 1969, 70, 71, you know, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, Jewel Ornament of Liberation. You know, there were a few important books and not much else. And now you could line the entire place here with bookcases and books in English now that are amazing. One of the books I read was a book by John Blofeld called The Tantric Mysticism of Tibet. John Blofeld mostly wrote about China and Chinese Buddhism, but this was a book about Tibet, and it was, you know, a very interesting, helpful book. And for some reason, I noticed the dedication. I don't know that I can remember any book dedication, but it hooked me. It was dedicated to the lamas in Scotland. Mm-hmm. And I thought, lamas in Scotland? What's that about? So when I was in London, I found my way to the London Buddhist Society, which was a venerable place for some decades. And I asked the person there, you know anything about llamas in Scotland? And they said, oh yeah, there's a brochure over here. I still have it, advertising this place called Samyeling, which Trungpa Rinpoche had founded with his boyhood friend Akong Rinpoche. And so I somehow called them up at some point and asked, can I come there? And yes, you can come. And so I went up there and spent, I think, about 3.5 weeks. Ron had injured himself in this other job that he had, so he couldn't come with me, but he joined me for the last week. It was a little bit like what Tail of the Tiger was like in Vermont that I later went to.
That is now called Karmacholing.
Karmacholing. Kind of funky old farmhouse-like place, with kind of a random assortment of cushions. Trungpa Rinpoche had just left and gone to North America. So I didn't meet him yet.
Oh, okay.
But I felt I did connect with him there. Meditation in Action had just been published. Born in Tibet had already been a couple years published, and I read them.
Meditation in Action was the first meditation book, the first training book, was it?
Well, for him.
For him,
yes.
from him,
And
yes.
it's really his first book.
Yeah.
Because Born in Tibet, he didn't really write. He sort of talked to this Esme Kramer Roberts, and she wrote it up. So it
Do
really
people
is-
know Born in Tibet? That's the story of Trungpa Rinpoche's walking out of Tibet
And his growing
over the
up,
Himalayas,
growing up.
and growing up into.
And there are lots of good things in there.
Yes, it's wonderful. Okay.
But Meditation Action really was his teachings.
So tell us when you met him. What was that?
So
What was that?
coming back, that was inspiring. And then one of my high school buddies, he and I, we were deadheads. The Grateful Dead, you've heard of them. And we're hanging out in New Jersey. This is, being back home from college in Michigan. And he had a copy of the Village Voice, which was kind of a cool newspaper in those days. Does it still exist?
No.
Okay. At any rate, it was an important magazine or newspaper. And there was an ad for a program at Tail of the Tiger, Karma Chilling, some seminar. And Tom, my friend Tom, was very drawn to there was a big picture of Trungpa Rinpoche, and he was drawn to this, and he kind of, there's something about this person. And he handed it to me, and I had never met him. I think I had seen his picture, but it was the name, Chogyam Trungpa. Oh, I know him. I was at his center in Scotland. It was probably 1 a.m. We're hanging out. And I just picked up the phone and called Tail of the Tiger at 1 a.m, which was not exactly a nice thing to do to anybody. Somebody answered the phone. They were quite irate. But, do you realize what time it is? And sorry. The seminar was starting that next day, that morning. And I said, gee, could I come? I didn't know about you. And yes, just go to bed. Leave us alone. You can come. And I did. I literally just got in my mother's car and drove up to Barnett. And, I had a very moving, I wasn't exactly looking for a guru, but I was. But I didn't kind of know that I was, I think. I don't know how to describe that. I was definitely on a path, but I didn't quite know what path I was on. But, his books had been moving. Being at Samyeling was also important. Kala Rinpoche came to Samyeling. For the first time, he came to the West. So I met him at Samyeling. I know I'm backtracking a little, but, he was a very important.
Well, let us know about your encounter with Trungpa Rinpoche. With Trungpa Rinpoche, the first one. Okay. We want to get there.
I want to talk about Kala Rinpoche for a moment, because, he's another important
who he
Lama,
is.
and everybody there wanted to have an interview with him, and somebody translated, because he didn't speak any English. And I remember him saying to me, do you want to be a bodhisattva? And I I knew that a bodhisattva was like a good person. That is all I knew. I did not know anything really what that meant. And, I said, well, I hope so, or something like that. And he laughed. And he was very, warm and, nice to be with. But I'll never forget, I thought to myself, he's a nice old man. And, he wasn't that old then. But he looked like he was at least 20 years older. He kind of always looked old. And I thought to myself, he's a nice old man, but he's not going to learn English. I'm not going to learn Tibetan. This is a waste of time. Like, where am I going to go with this? So then I go to Tail of the Tiger, and as I'm driving down the driveway, I find myself, I'm in tears. I'm like really overcome emotionally, and I had no idea why. It really was something odd, but I could feel that I am now connecting with somebody important, and that was kind of the beginning and end, like this was it.
And you were alone in the car.
I was alone,
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Nobody to talk to. I knew nobody in our community. At Samiling, I had met one person who uttered the name Chogyam Trungpa, or Trungpa Rinpoche. He was, I didn't understand this, but he was kind of persona non grata at Samiling, because Akong had thrown him out, literally. I didn't know anything about all that. But Harry was a fellow from Philadelphia, and Harry had kind, nice things to say about this Trungpa Rinpoche, whose books I was reading. Mm-hmm. The first person I meet at Tail of the Tiger, Harry.
Oh, interesting.
And Harry had been with his girlfriend Linda in Scotland, and Linda was very pregnant in Scotland. Now the baby was there, and there were Harry and Linda. And it's like, Harry, it's like, wow. And he was like, oh, and we kind of hugged and, and then he said, this place is awful for children, which it was, and maybe still is. It certainly continued to be not really a good place to bring kids for a long time. And he's like, we're out of here. It's the last I've ever seen or heard of Harry.
No more Harry.
Nope. But I felt like this was almost like a relay thing, like I was being handed off by Harry. I mean, I don't know what any of this means, but there was something nice about that, to see him. And then, in those days, going to a seminar usually came with having an interview. Like it was, you had to ask, but it was without question available. And I had 2 interviews with Rinpoche during that seminar. And I don't actually remember them much, but it was good to meet him. But it's like, I'm your student, that's it. It was just the driveway demonstrated that. I don't think it was at this seminar, but it was at one early seminar that there was an interchange that I think I told you about that was, as a translator, language person, this was meaningful. Somebody asked him a question about, I have no idea what, and the answer, I remember. He said, well, whatever this was, he said, it's very much like the meditation of Ramana Maharshi. And those of us who were yoga people, Ramana Maharshi was like super important. He was like an amazing, self-realized kind of yogi. And Rinpoche was obviously speaking of him with great reverence. And I later came to know, yes, he thought Ramana Maharshi was totally amazing. So he's saying, it's like the meditation of Ramana Maharshi. Who am I? Was his meditation. Who am I is not a question. It's a statement. And I'm like, wow, that's interesting. And he paused, and then he said, it's like, who's on first? What's on second? And I thought to myself, holy shit, this is a Tibetan Lama quoting Abbott and Costello perfectly. I mean, how could he know this? And then I thought to myself, this man could never be conned by people like me. He knows everything about who we are. Like, this is scary.
Wonderful.
That was my,
Thank you.
Yeah.
So the next origin story that may be of interest is how you became a translator. So Larry's life work has been to teach and also to translate or lead a committee of translators. So, yeah, well, Trungpa Rinpoche, in a sense, brought you into that profession. So tell us about him as the originator of Nalanda
Yep.
and the people he gathered and how you became a part of that.
Yeah. It was very haphazard.
What
And-
year is it?
74, 75
In Boulder now.
in Boulder.
Okay.
He had students in England who knew some Tibetan, notably Michael Hookham, who later became known as Rigzin Shikpo. I don't know how he learned Tibetan, but he knew enough to do something, and a fellow named Alf Weil. And the two of them worked with Trungpa Rinpoche on some texts in England at Oxford. Just before Rinpoche left England, the last year or so, he met Francesca Fremantle, who was getting a PhD in Sanskrit and also knew some Tibetan. So they were before us, earlier, translators and people who worked with him a little bit, who I later came to know. And in Boulder, there were, I don't know, maybe 6 or 8 of us who wanted to learn Tibetan. Like when I was in college, especially after becoming his student, I still had 2 years of college. I really wanted to study Tibetan. I was already studying Sanskrit and Little Pali, and even a little Vedic Sanskrit, but they didn't teach Tibetan. There were very few universities.
This is University of Michigan, Ann Arbor.
Yeah, a good college. They taught lots of languages, like Burmese and Thai, but they didn't teach Tibetan. And one of my professor friends said, there is a professor here who knows Tibetan, D.R. Shackleton Bailey. Ever heard of him? British guy. He translated Mater Cheta, a very famous Sanskrit poet. He was in the classics department. And Pete Becker told me about him. So I went to his office. It was like there were cobwebs. It was so musty and weird. And, this British guy who was teaching Greek and Latin. And I said, Pete Becker tells me that you know Tibetan. Or I said, I understand you know some Tibetan. Who told you that? And I said, well, Pete Becker, who was a linguistics professor. He said, well, I don't do that anymore. I said, well, could I learn something from you? No, I don't do that. And he went to his bookcase and he grabbed this thin grammar by Yeshke that many of us did look at. He threw it to me across the room. He said, you'll figure it out. Here, bring the book back before you leave, but you couldn't use it. And I did teach myself the alphabet a little. So, there wasn't any way to study Tibetan. There were a few universities, but I wasn't at one of them. And then when I finished college, Rinpoche said, I'll see you in Boulder, go to Boulder, because that was really the big center. And so there were another half a dozen or more people that were like me. They had some language background. They wanted to learn Tibetan. And there was a Tibetan geshe who had just come to Boulder after the 1973 seminary, Geshe Wangchuk, Sakya Geshe, very depressed, kind of manic depressive kind of guy. He tried to teach us a little something. And any rate, we asked Rinpoche, could we learn Tibetan with you? So he said, okay. And I was an administrator at Naropa the first 2 years. So I had an office. Rinpoche came to my office. I had a blackboard. And he gave a Tibetan class. It's actually on tape. We have a recording of this.
The first class.
I didn't know. I didn't remember until relatively recently. I was told, oh yeah, it's in the archive.
So how many people were in the room that
6 or 8.
the ones who wanted?
Yeah.
And your inspiration was to ask.
We want to know everything.
Okay.
We want to know about this stuff.
You wanted to read the original text.
Original. I mean, we had this guy who was kind of original, but we wanted the original. At any rate, so, what did he teach us was the lineage supplication, the Kagyu lineage supplication. Great Vajradhara Tila. We all knew that pretty much by heart.
Yeah.
Francesca had translated it. We were chanting her translation. And Rinpoche wrote it on the blackboard in Tibetan. And, it was so exciting. Because we already knew it, and now we were like really going to know it. It was very cool and exciting. I'm not sure, but I think he gave 2 classes. He was not particularly a good language teacher. He could not explain the grammar very well.
Amazing,
And
because his
much.
language is so incredible.
Oh yeah, he's amazingly
Fluent.
yes, definitely. But it's often the case that native speakers don't really know how to teach their own language, and I think he fell into that. He certainly understood it, could tell you what it meant.
Yeah.
But to explain little bits, he certainly could, but he wasn't really a language teacher. But it was,
So
we
he-
already knew what it meant.
But he encouraged you,
Yes.
and
did.
it came to fruition.
Yes, it came to, well, for me, so this is my little journey, and I think each one of us probably has their own stories. But for me, when I first got to know him, I'm sure I told him I was studying Sanskrit and I hoped to learn Tibetan. And I'm sure he filed that somewhere. And he was very super appreciative of Sanskrit. He knew lots of Sanskrit words. He did not know the language or the grammar, but he knew hundreds, at least 200 or 300 Sanskrit words, which is for a Tibetan very unusual. And he obviously had some special reverence for Sanskrit. And at some point, I think it was in early 1974, he gave me 4 or 5 Tibetan texts that had the Vajrasattva mantra written out. And he said, would you please make a proper grammatical version of the mantra that is correct? The Tibetans, it's a little sloppy. So here's what I have. Would you make an authoritative whatever? I had 2.5 years of Sanskrit. I am not a Sanskritist, but the mantra means something. It's and I knew enough to take a stab at it. And it turns out I did an okay job. I'm happy to say. He really wanted the mantra to be correct. And each of these manuscripts that he gave me, every one had a couple different variant readings. Not a single one of them were really correct, which is not unusual for a culture that it was 1,000 years earlier that these people knew the language. It had been lost. Most Tibetans didn't know Sanskrit. So that was my first sort of translation project, and he wanted me to translate it because it does mean something.
I remember you telling me how the Nalanda, how you arrived at Nalanda as the name of the translation committee.
Oh, yeah.
And that's an interesting story, is it not?
Yeah.
I remember
it was a scary moment.
a table and you all sitting around it and coming up with a name.
Well, it wasn't quite that way. It was, I actually don't know how we were called the Nalanda Translation Committee. I know where Nalanda came in, and I'll tell you that. That's
Okay.
the story you're remembering.
Yes.
But calling us Nalanda Translation Committee, and I've asked all my friends who were there then, nobody could remember. None of us remember exactly how the sequence happened. But in 1973, which is the year I moved to Boulder from finishing college, that summer there were 2 seminars happening at Rocky Mountain Dharma Center, now called Drala Mountain Center in northern Colorado. And those of us living in Boulder just kind of went up there for a month, a couple seminars. And during that time, the 2 of Rinpoche's sort of most senior students, who were kind of his right-hand people administratively, John Baker and Marvin Casper, they gathered together a group of about 12 to 15 of us to talk about the idea of starting a college, which was going to be located at RMDC, along with a bunch of kind of craft industries. They had a loom factory, and somebody made hash pipes, not exactly a commercial venture. And that people were going to live there too. A lot of people had houses there. So that we got together, a group of us, and I was included because I had just graduated from college and I had studied Sanskrit. I knew a couple Buddhist scholars, and but some of the people were actually college professors and had much more of a cachet for starting a college. We met as a group a few times, and Rinpoche came to these meetings. And I think it was during the first meeting, the idea of, okay, this is a good idea, we're going to do this. What are we going to call it? Well, Rinpoche really wanted to we should call this Nalanda University. And I knew about Nalanda University. It was a very important institution in India, northern India, that I think it existed for 600 or more years, many, many hundreds of years, very venerable. And when he said that, I thought to myself, that's not a good idea. But everybody else was like, okay, that's cool or nice or whatever. And so I was very nervous to actually kind of object to this. And I very sort of sheepishly raised my hand and said, I knew Rinpoche a little bit, but I wasn't one of his administrators. I was just a student. And I didn't know him that well. So this was very nervy of me to say something. And I said, I don't think this is a good idea. And everybody's like, what? Like, who the fuck are you? Even though we all kind of knew each other a little bit. And I said, well, I just think it would be presumptuous. I just graduated college, and, the people I studied with, they would laugh at us. They would think, who the hell are you to call yourself Nalanda University? And I said to him something like, it would be like, oh, let's start a college and let's call it Harvard. And had I really had my wits about me, I would have said Oxford. That definitely would have gotten it. But Harvard was good enough. And, we discussed it a little. And in the end, Rinpoche said, okay, we'll think of something else. He accepted that. And I was like, wow. I mean, it was scary for me to, kind of argue with him. But he was the kind of person that enjoyed that. He didn't mind. He encouraged it. But it still was scary for, I think, most of us to. And then the next day he came back and thought about, how about Naropa? Okay, nobody had a problem with that. He was a principal person at Nalanda, Yeah. Any rate, so Naropa worked, and that was that.
Yeah.
About 8 months later, there is a point to this story. About 8 months later, I'm walking up the stairs at 1111 Pearl Street, where our offices were, and meditation hall and so forth. And it was a big staircase, And Rinpoche was coming towards the staircase from his office at the end of the hall. So he's coming toward, and I'm coming up, and he sees me about, 5 steps from the top. And he leans over the railing and goes like, "I've got you now." And I'm like, "What?" "I've just created Nalanda Foundation. What do you think of that?" And I said, "What is that?" He said, "This will be our overarching company for Naropa, and I have other ideas. This is going to be not religious. We'll have other things in this. So what do you think of that?" And I said, "Well, I don't think there's a problem with just Nalanda, as long as we don't say university." And that was that. And, for me, this has come around in a way, because it's just 4 years ago, roughly, that the translation committee, which has been part of this thing called Nalanda Foundation, we're the only surviving entity. Naropa became so important and successful, it had to become its own separate corporation a long time ago. Shambhala Training, also used to be part of Nalanda. At any rate, I won't bore you with the corporate history, but we're the only survivors. And we had some problems with the bigger organization, and we wound up having to reorganize. And now, we really are Nalanda Foundation. And so that it's kind of something nice about all this little coming around.
Yes. So it's been consistent throughout since 1973.
When the Sakyong, the current Sakyong, was kind of renaming everything Shambhala, there were some people who said, "Well, you should become the Shambhala translation." And I forget it, not interested. It's fine. This is not broken. We're not going to try to fix this.
Yeah.
So,
What would you say? I just want to say that since the last few years in my own Dharma study, I've come to immense appreciation for translators and realize not only do they provide us with the original text in English, but that they are teachers themselves. They know the Dharma and can share the Dharma. And I really have now such a deep appreciation. So,
and that's why we studied Tibetan.
Yeah.
We wanted to know more Dharma.
Yeah.
And you do get some special insight by studying these original texts.
Yeah.
Even though, the stuff in English is excellent.
What would you say is Nalanda's mission, and has it changed since the beginning, the translation committee? What was your intention when you started? And you've been the director from the get-go.
Not from the very beginning. No. Lodro Dorje, Dorje Lopen, and Sherab Chudzin, Michael Cohn, they were the two, I think they were called coordinators. I was part of the group.
So what was the
A couple of years
aspiration?
later, I became the director.
Okay. Yeah. Well, it's been a lifelong position. Yeah.
Yeah.
So mission or aspiration.
The mission was very simple. The way it was born, actually, as a group, there were Lodro and Sherab and Dana Dudley, Chris Kaiser, a couple other people were in Boulder. And I was too, but then I went off to Vermont. Robin Kornman was living in Vermont, and he and I were super close friends. And then Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche showed up in 1976 while Robin and I were still at Karme Choling. And he came with 2 attendants. One was a monk from Sermang, Yunten, who's a really interesting character, and Lama Ujin, Shenpen, was the other attendant. And the night before they were going to go back to Asia, so they toured around America for, 3-4 months. The night before they were going back, Ujin had a dream that maybe he should stay in America. And he did not know a word of English. He was a year or two younger than Trungpa Rinpoche, so he was early 30s. 1976, Rinpoche was 36 years old. Ujin was probably 35. Yeah, I mean, it's amazing.
So he made Naropa College or Institute.
He was 30. He was 33 when we had this Nalanda Naropa thing. Yeah, the college opened in 1974. This is the 50th anniversary of the opening, but for me, it's the 51st anniversary because it's really started in 73. It took a whole year to put it together. So Ujin had this dream, and he went to his guru, Khensa Rinpoche. What do you think? Is this something I should pay attention to? And Khensa Rinpoche said, well, let me talk with Trungpa Rinpoche. And they talked, and Trungpa Rinpoche said, yes, Ujin could be very helpful. We will take care of him. And Khensa Rinpoche left him with us. And, you know, I mean, like, what to do with this man who doesn't know a word of English? So Rinpoche sent him to Karme Choling because, you know, somebody provided meals, there was a place to live, you know, it was a place that a person like him, you know, could fit in. And Robin and I were like, wow, okay. You know, so we wanted to learn Tibetan, right? And, you know, we taught him a little English, but other people helped with the English, you know, and we worked with him on a short Vajrayogini sadhana, which was at the end of the Kagyu Ngundro text. We were all doing our Ngundro, you know, this preliminary practices, and it's a preliminary in order to receive this empowerment on a yidam, a deity called Vajrayogini. And the text of the Ngundro, the preliminary text ends, the Tibetan text ends with a short Vajrayogini sadhana. So we thought, well, let's get a jump on this. And, you know, so we translated that with Ujin. And, you know, he was learning some English and, you know, we were learning a little Tibetan. And then it was time, another long story, that Robin and me were asked to move to RMDC. I was going to be the co-director.
Rocky Mountain Shambhala Center.
Now Drala Mountain Center.
Yes. In northern Colorado.
Northern Colorado. And we asked, could we take Ujin with us? And it was the Vajra Regent who was the one giving us our marching orders. Rinpoche was on his way into retreat for a year. And the word came back, yes, take Ujin. I want you guys to translate up there. Have a little translation committee. And on the way, come to the seminary, we're going to work on the Vajrayogini sadhana. So this is the 1976 seminary in the fall in Land O'Lakes, Wisconsin, way up north in Wisconsin, very near the Canadian border. And so Robin and Ujin and I, you know, the three whatevers, I had a car. We drove from Vermont to Wisconsin. And we stopped in Ann Arbor. I had to see all my college friends. We took Ujin to the first movie. He went to see Gone with the Wind. The entire audience is in tears, you know, at certain points. And Ujin's like, what is going on here? He had no idea what was going on. Anyway, we get to the seminary, and we come into this, I think it was called the King's Gate Hotel or something. But as we got out of the car, it was like early evening, around this time, still a little bit of light. We heard some kind of knocking, and we're like, where is that coming from? And sure enough, up in a window in the hotel, there was Rinpoche banging on the window, seeing us arriving. And as soon as like we saw each other, he's like, you know, come on up, you know. And, you know, it took a while to figure out where he was, but we finally got there, and he sat us down, and he said, listen to this. Like, you won't believe this. And then David Rome was there, his personal secretary, and David began to read the beginning of the Golden Sun of the Great East, which is what we call the root text of Shambhala. Rinpoche was in the process of receiving this terma, this treasure teaching about this place called Shambhala. And I remember Robin and I looked like this is like from another solar system. Like, what is this about? Was very strange. And they had written a poem a couple days earlier. Rinpoche wrote a poem called Tungshi. And then he wrote it, and his cook, Max King, and Max's wife, Carolyn King, now known as Carolyn Gimian, offered commentary at Rinpoche's urging. So Rinpoche wrote this poem, and then Max and Carolyn and Rinpoche made a little commentary on the poem. So David read that to us as well. And I mean, this was really like extraterrestrial.
So it's interesting that you say that, because I remember once you said to me, being around Rinpoche summarily was like being with a person from another planet.
Yeah, in part.
I wonder if you could kind of
mean,
say what it was like to be around him.
I mean, most of the time it was very boring. But it was scary. So it's kind of weird, because there's this kind of being very intimidated, but also, I mean, he was a kind of ordinary person like us, and, you know, knew our language and did, you know, things that were, you know, sort of normal things. But he was not really like us, fundamentally. I mean, in so many different ways. And yet, in so many ways, he was just like us. So it was very, very enigmatic. And, as I say, it was intimidating to be in his presence. And a lot of the time, especially those of us who had reason to be with him for long periods of time, and I did because of being a translator, we spent hours. A lot of that time was just very sort of ordinary, not particularly like amazing, let alone interesting. And it was in some ways boring, but not in a bad way. So I don't know. I think the best portrait of him in a human sense is Lady Diana's book. I really think it's an excellent portrayal of this person as a human being. Anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And she was married to him.
Yes, so she had a very special relationship and view that no one else could even quite imagine.
So would you sum up by saying what's the mission of Nalanda?
Our mission at the first was to help him to put things into English. You know, his vocabulary, I would say his vocabulary was exceeded most of his students. He knew more words than most of us.
You mean in English?
In English, yes. His syntax sometimes was pretty good, if not exact, but mostly it was not. So it was sloppy. And he used it to amazing effect. He said things that we couldn't say. And I don't think he sort of knew that. I think it just happened in a very natural way. But he said things that a native speaker would never say because it's not grammatical. But it was so sort of beautifully ambiguous or, you know, double, triple meaninged. So it was very convenient that he did not have good syntax. But his vocabulary was huge, huge.
Which he learned in a rather short period of time.
Yeah, 5 years at Oxford, little bit in India. Yeah, I mean, immense. He owned and used a huge amount the Oxford English Dictionary in 13 very large volumes, not that super tiny microscopic version, but he had the big print, you know, like it was easy to read. And we went to that, and it was always in the room where we translated, the dining room. Oh, got to look this up. Hundreds of words did we look up. And I mean, it's not like he read the Oxford English Dictionary, but he was very familiar with it. And he would be unbelievably thrilled to know that I don't know, third, fourth, I don't know, the edition of the OED that was published, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, includes the word egolessness with him as the primary reference.
Bravo.
How cool is that? I mean, that's so amazing. He was just, I mean, that would be orgasmic for him. So,
Wonderful. Thank you. We still don't know what the mission of Nalanda Translation Committee is to this day,
we're working on it.
but we're very grateful that you exist and that the committee continues to exist, and grateful for all the translations that the committee has given us. So perhaps there may be a question?
I listened quite a lot to the recordings of Alan Watts, and in one of his recordings he talks about the notion of holiness and it being a kind of something that incorporates the whole of the person, so the dark and the light. And he said that he, in looking for a holy person, he was always searching for something that he called like a fundamental rascality, like a rascalness. And he said that he found that in Trungpa Rinpoche.
Well, I don't know that about Alan Watts, but it's interesting. And, calling Rinpoche a rascal, yeah, that makes some sense. It's a little derogatory, but it's also kind of a compliment in a way. Irreverent, for sure, and yet incredibly faithful to the tradition, but in a context that appeared irreverent more than it was. So, and Rinpoche had dinner with Alan Watts on his houseboat in Sausalito the night before he died. The night before Alan Watts died. Yeah. Yep. And I wasn't with him, but a number of his students were, and probably could tell you more. They were friends. I don't think much happened of note, maybe. But, Alan Watts was a huge influence on my generation. Many of us read, and he wrote a lot of books.
Yes.
And they were very helpful in getting us onto a path. Especially the Zen path, but for me too. Yeah. I heard him speak.
As a speaker, it was wonderful.
Yes, but I also found him very arrogant and problematic. He was very drunk the one time I heard him speak. And it was kind of a little disconcerting because it wasn't what I imagined him might be like from reading the books. So it was a little bit disappointing. But
Well, he had a radio program.
I never heard it.
Yeah, well, that
But he
was
did.
a little more formal,
Yeah.
not drunk.
No, I'm sure. Yeah.
Other question? Michelle Martin she's a translator.
And a very dear friend and colleague for many, many decades. Thank you for being here and all that you have done as well.
So my question is, when you were working with Trungpa on text, can you recall like an interesting discussion on how to translate a particular term that you went around on and chose different things and finally settled on one term?
I don't know that there's something that stands out as a great example, but there were lots and lots of times where it took a lot of discussion to come up with something. Nghe Dun, for example, Trong Dun Nghe Dun, which we wound up settling on. I think we said literal meaning and true meaning, but I'm not positive. I think and there were many, many alternatives. And to this day, I'm not sure I agree with that, but that was very difficult to come up with. Prajna and jnana, Sherabin Yeshe, are these very important terms. And they don't often come up together necessarily, but they're so important. And the Sanskrit and the Tibetan, they're both super important. And they're both from the verbal root to know in Tibetan she. So she rab, best, like highest, knowing. And ye she, kind of primordial knowing. Now that's a Tibetan. In Sanskrit, jnana, is just some kind of knowing. And prajna, it's a little hard to say. The jna is the same. And pra means so many different things, it's hard to know what to say. But after a huge amount of discussion, we really felt we needed to standardize these, no matter what the context, so that people would know, if they knew our lingo, we said prajna would be knowledge and jnana would be wisdom. And that was because the feeling of the meaning in Tibetan of yeshe is, this is innate. This is not something you acquire. It is, fundamental to your being. So wisdom is kind of a bigger deal than knowledge in that sense. And prajna is something that maybe you also have some innate sense, but you develop, and your prajna can become better and more refined. And so that's why we said knowledge for prajna and wisdom for jnana. Both words could use for either. There's no question this is just a somewhat arbitrary, but that was our logic. And, at least this way, our readership, when they see knowledge, it's probably prajna. But during one of our translation sessions, Judd Levinson, who has come back to the fold, by the way, Judd sort of disappeared into the world of Hasidic Judaism for 35 years. Kind of amazing. And really serious. But he came back a few years ago, and now back to Vajrayana Buddhism. He's finished with Hasidic, whatever. But if you want to know anything about the Hasidic world, he's your guy. And we're old friends, and now we're friends again. Haven't seen him for 35 years. He was teaching a course at the 79 or 80 seminary in Lake Louise, Alberta. And he was teaching people something from the Lankavatara Sutra. And Alaya comes up in this quite a bit in a Yogacara sense. So he was asking Rinpoche about this term. And it provoked one of the more interesting discussions that we had. And Rinpoche talked about several different kinds of alaya. Alaya vijnana, which is the eighth consciousness of 8 consciousnesses, which is a very kind of substratum, almost subconscious, maybe you could call, out of which other consciousnesses kind of arise. But he also talked about, and this is from a very Vajrayana point of view, a more self-luminous, Rangrik Rangsal in Tibetan, kind of alaya that is much more wakeful, and a more primordial kind of alaya. And like in the slogans, the Atisha or Geshe Chekawa from Atisha's teachings, Kadampa slogans, Lojong, mind training slogans, there's rest in the nature of alaya. So what alaya is that? It's a really interesting question. And Rinpoche's response is, well, it depends on your understanding and development. And, at least it means the alaya vijnana, the consciousness. But if you have a more, greater sense of things and better understanding, ultimately it's a more fruitional alaya that is not confused. Alaya consciousness is definitely samsaric and confused, but it could be something much more wakeful and primordial. So it's whatever you can manage to rest in that sense. And this discussion really went on. It was a long discussion. We recorded all of our meetings. We didn't record the Vajrayogini sadhana meetings at the 76 seminary. Yeah, I started with that, that was the birth of Shambhala, and at the same time, it was the birth of the translation committee. That we really came together as a committee and had this rather large task of translating a 120-page sadhana, which took, most of the seminary to do. And that was an amazing process. So this was like a double-barrel shotgun of deep Vajrayana and Shambhala happening at the same moment. Separate, but together. Very powerful. So that Aliyah discussion, which came a few years later, was recorded. And at some point, many years ago, we were digitizing these tapes. They were cassette tapes. And Tingzin, my colleague in Halifax, Tingzin Utro, Scott Beard, was doing the digitizing. He'd put in a tape and do his work. And he wasn't really listening because it's mostly pretty boring, our meetings. But this was interesting. And this got him to stop. And he just wow. This is really amazing. So he transcribed it, and you can find it on our website. The discussion about Aliyah. So that's a really good example of, and it wasn't about how to translate it, but, it was some of what happened at these meetings.
Well, I think that's one of the wonders of this newsletter, is that there will be a discussion of a word and how you arrived at the English equivalent. That would be very circuitous.
Yep.
And with lots of participation.
Yep.
By various lamas as well as your committee. It's so fascinating. Yeah. Okay. Daniel?
Speaking of which, core emergence, how did that?
That's a
Instead
Guntherism.
of conate.
Well, we never heard of the word conate. I did not know that word until Elizabeth Callahan started using it.
That's how
Yeah, I literally had never heard of that word, I don't think. Co-emergence, I'm pretty sure, was coined by Herbert Gunther. It's not in the dictionary, or maybe it is now, but it wasn't at the time technically an English word in usage, but Rinpoche loved it. So we borrowed it from Gunther.
Instead of worked on conate.
I can't stand conate. As soon as you say conate, I keep thinking of the Coneheads. I mean, I go right to Dan Aykroyd, and I don't know.
It feels weird, doesn't
It
it?
feels weird. Yeah.
Andrew, you had a question.
I have kind of 1.5 questions. But it seems to me that our use of Sanskrit in our sadhanas and with Prajna, is because it was the academic language at the time to illustrate ancient spiritual terms like this, but you still actually translated from Tibetan with English using Sanskrit as your mode of translation, and you still creatively used the Sanskrit words the same way that you creatively translated Tibetan into English.
Well, what we've done, and again, this is very much with Rinpoche's participation and somewhat insistence, if there was a good English word to use for an important term that might have come from Sanskrit and then into Tibetan, if there was a good English word, most of the time we used it. But when it was difficult, like the best example I can think of quickly is bodhicitta. Bodhicitta, bodhi means, it's from the verbal root bud, to awake. Like Buddha is a perfect passive participle. Awakened. So it means waking up, enlightened, whatever. Chitta can mean mind or heart. So that's a big range. Culturally, people point to different parts of their body when they talk about mind. And we spent hours talking about bodhicitta and could not come up with something that we really felt this is like a good way to do it. And in that case, Rinpoche said, this is too important. I don't want people to not know this is bodhicitta. This is an important term. We will use bodhicitta. And they will have to learn the word and look it up and find out more and learn more about what does this word mean. And he truly hoped it would become an English word and become like yoga and Buddha, Dharma. There's lots of Sanskrit words that are also now English words. Do people really know what they mean? Probably not, mostly. But they can at least know, okay, it's a foreign word. It's now in English. We can look it up. And while I have you here, a lot of people say bodhicitta. That is an enlightened cat. So there's no long mark on the I. So it's chitta. It's not bodhicitta.
Thank you.
So just in case you wondered.
So how did we come up with basic goodness?
In the Shambhala text world, it does exist, but in one of the later texts, and not the earliest. And when we saw it, it was, so that's what it is in Tibetan. But it was already in common usage by Trungpa Rinpoche. So I really think this is English that eventually popped up in the Terma. Yeah. I also think that's true of the four dignities in Shambhala: meek, perky, outrageous, and inscrutable. There are Tibetan words for each of these that come up in the letter of the Black Ashe, but you would just never know that that's what that would mean if you only saw the Tibetan.
Because somebody was telling me that, he would purposely kind of redefine English words to, like egolessness, because there was really no good translation.
Well, selflessness is okay. Anatman is the Sanskrit, dakme in Tibetan. Some kind of non-self, selflessness is okay. And his usage of the word ego, someone was telling me, I'm not sure if this is true, as an English word did not occur until after Freud. It was never used in English.
It's not in Shakespeare.
Right. Okay. And of course, Rinpoche's use of the word ego and egolessness is not Freudian. So that's confusing a little, or maybe more than a little. But then there were lots of words, some words, I don't know how many, that, like prayer is, I think, a good example. We do not use the word pray or prayer. Rinpoche felt, he said, this word is not rehabilitatable. It is theistic, and you just can't make it non-theistic. It is so cemented to a theistic outlook. So we say supplication, aspiration, depending on, there's a few different words in Tibetan. And, the feeling of supplication is so different. It's almost, it's not exactly clinical, but it's not very emotive, and he liked that. Because he didn't want people to have this, somebody's going to save me feeling. So the other word that's not rehabilitatable is sin, which is an excellent translation of papa in Sanskrit or dikva in Tibetan. Yeah. Not bad, but, totally screwed up with the Judeo-Christian, and especially the original sin thing. You just can't use the word.
Neurotic crimes.
Neurotic crimes, yeah. Well, we changed that. That was for a few years, that's what we did. But then we moved to evil deeds. It was too eccentric. neurotic crimes. I mean, it conjures up strange
It does, like bad movies. Really weirdo movies.
So we changed that.
I mean, I could look this up, and I know so what is the Tibetan word for basic goodness? Do I know it?
Yeah. Dune Zangwa. Dune, like primordial, from the beginning. Dune Zangwa. Zangpo Zangwa. Goodness. So primordial goodness. Primordial goodness. But there's another.
Why didn't he use primordial?
I don't know. The translators weren't involved in crafting basic goodness.
Yeah.
He came out with basic goodness, and we were like, is that in Tibetan somewhere, And it was a couple of years before we saw it finally in Tibetan. Yeah.
Is Australia Tibetan? No, he made that up, right?
Is what?
Ashe.
Ashe. Oh, no, that's Tibetan.
Well, that is-
A is the last letter of the Tibetan alphabet, syllabary. And in that sense, A, in a sort of figurative sense, can mean primordial. It's often said to be like emptiness, but A in this sense means primordial, and She means stroke, like to make a stroke with a pen. So Ashe would be primordial stroke. It's also the word that's used for a visualization component in doing Chandali practice, Tumo in Tibetan. Completely different meaning, but the exact same word. Some people who know the 6 yogas practices think, oh, that's where he got Ashe. Nope. No, definitely completely different meaning, but it is the same word. So that's a Tibetan.
Thank you. Would you like to take one more? Jenny?
Thank you. I'm interested in the endlessness of translation. Do you feel that there are endless texts still to be translated?
Well, there are thousands. I don't know how many, but there's a lot of texts
That have not been translated?
that have not been translated.
And I'm wondering if there's one that you would particularly like to do.
No, not particularly. And I'm sure there's a lot that would be wonderful to have in English. So there is a lot left to do. And I think there's still a lot of good stuff to do. And I don't know, it's another couple generations at least. There are younger translators. And I hope you agree, I'm kind of amazed by how many more younger people are coming along. And, it's just like everything. They're much better than us. So many of them are learning the language better, and they have the benefit of, lots of other things that have been translated. We are sort of among the pioneers. We're not the first. There are many others that came before my generation, but it's coming along. So that's great. And there's a lot to do.
Well, perhaps we can end with you mentioning the discovery or the recent publication of Trungpa Rinpoche's writings from when he was living in Tibet
Okay.
that we now have
Yeah.
access to.
Yeah, we do. So his nephew, who was born, I think, 5 years after Rinpoche left Tibet, his nephew never met his uncle. Karma Senge Rinpoche is his name. And Karma Senge Rinpoche was a student of a very important Sermang teacher named Drukthop Karma Norbu, who remained in Tibet, even though lots of his friends left. And, for whatever it's worth, when Trungpa Rinpoche gave the Rinchen Terze Abhishekas, about 800 Abhishekas, big collection of Jamgon Kongtrul the Great, Karma Norbu gave the lungs, the reading transmissions. Rinpoche gave the Abhishekas. He was a very venerable teacher who remained in Tibet. And during the Cultural Revolution, he went up to some very high mountain cave and existed on like a tiny bit of tsampa every day for, 12 years or something. And he became a super realized person. And Karma Senge Rinpoche became a student of his. When he passed away, Karma Sengye went to another teacher who knew Trungpa Rinpoche very well, a very good kind of a boyhood friend who also remained in Tibet. His name was Ujin Tenzin. And Ujin Tenzin was often with Trungpa Rinpoche when he was discovering termas. Trungpa Rinpoche began discovering termas at the age of 3 years old. And
So maybe you say terma is a...
terma is a treasure text that has been somehow deposited by someone for future generations. And a lot of the termas are from Padmasambhava, but not always. Yeshe Tsogyal, one of his main consorts, is usually the person responsible for hiding them. And they're hidden for often hundreds of years to be discovered at a particular time, in a particular place, by someone in particular, or with a bunch of people around them, and it's a particular teaching. So these 5 excellences come together, and then it happens.
So Trungpa Rinpoche discovered.
So Trungpa Rinpoche was a tertun, a terma discoverer, and most of his termas in Tibet are what's called earth termas. They're physical things that he discovered. And usually they had some syllables that they looked like syllables, but nobody can read them except for the tertun, the treasure discoverer. And then from being able to read them, he kind of decodes the terma, and out comes the text. And Ujin Tenzin was often the person to write them down, and Rinpoche would orally sort of decode them, and Ujin Tenzin wrote them down. So Karma Sengye became a student of Ujin Tenzin, and Ujin Tenzin inspired him about his uncle. He said, you know, your uncle was like an amazing person, and told him a lot about him. And he said, you must collect what remains of his writings. So that inspired Karma Sengye to go around. He met over 90 students of Trungpa Rinpoche over the course of 18 or 19 years.
So tell us how old Trungpa Rinpoche was when he was living in Tibet, discovering these terma.
From the age of 3 to 19.
Thank you.
He left when he was 19 years old. He had discovered, by my best guess, about 3,000 pages worth of writings. Karma Sengye has found about 400 or 500 pages. So he found what he could from all these people. He traveled around. And one of the people that he happened on, some village, there was an older woman who heard that, oh, there's this person coming around looking for Trungpa Rinpoche's writings, and she had something. And apparently Trungpa Rinpoche had told this woman, he wrote something down and gave it to her, little scrap of paper, 10 or 12 lines. He said to her, please keep this on your person always. Put it in, this little reliquary you wear on your neck. In the future, somebody will ask you for this. He might be my nephew, but maybe he's not a relative. But he said he might be my nephew. So the woman hears about this, and here comes the nephew. But she looked at the guy and she thought, I don't know about him. He doesn't feel like the right person. But she got out her gao, she opened it up, and she showed him the writing. It was a prophecy of Karma Sengye being born. Wow. Trungpa Rinpoche's stock went up through the roof in Karma Sengye's mind at that point. I mean, he just burst into tears. It's like, this is about me.
Wow.
Yeah. So he collected what he could, and when the Sakyong went to Tibet in 2001, they met. They're first cousins. Karma Sengye is the son of one of Trungpa Rinpoche's sisters. And Karma Sengye gave the Sakyong about 300 pages of the writings that he had collected. And they were written down by Ujin Tenzin. He had copied them all. There were more, but that was an initial big thing. And when the Sakyong came back, he gave that to me. And we started then working on it. And over the next 20 years or so, we got more. We met Karma Senge, and he gave us more things. And Karma Senge, just a couple years ago, he hired some Kenpos to edit, because a lot of this stuff was not well put together, because a lot of it had been dictated. Some people weren't that literate. And our work on this stuff was totally backwards. We're looking at the unedited versions, and it's like, the spelling, some things it was obvious, and a lot of things, you need a lot of help when you're not a native person. And we would work with Karma Senge and Kenpo from Sermang, and, if they had edited it first and then give it to us, that would have been nice. But that didn't happen that way. So now he finally put it all together, and it's published in 4 fairly large volumes. Wow. And this is everything Trungpa Rinpoche wrote in Tibetan or discovered as termas. About 20 or 30% of it are termas. The rest are just writings. But he continued to both write and to discover more termas when he went to India and then Great Britain and North America. So this collection includes everything that starts in Tibetan. So it doesn't have any of his English stuff. That's another project that we hope somebody will translate into Tibetan.
Larry, did Trungpa Rinpoche write something that maybe I'm getting confused, but in Tibet, there was a crossing, I don't know if it was part of the Exodus.
Born in Tibet?
Was it on a boat? Were they Shambhala writings?
There's a 2-volume work.
They got lost.
Yes, there's a 2-volume.
And he was sad.
Yes. Trungpa Rinpoche wrote 2 volumes, and it's mentioned in Born in Tibet. And in Born in Tibet, it said that he wrote this allegory of the kingdom of Shambhala. That's the way he put it. And those 2 volumes are still lost. We don't know what happened to them. And when he came out of Tibet, this was very unfortunate. He wished that he had been able to bring this, but he didn't. I mean, they were eating their shoes at the end. I mean, really, this was not an easy journey. But he did bring some things with him. But most of what we now have is from Karma Senge collecting. It's not from Trungpa Rinpoche bringing. And when he came out of Tibet, he wanted to recreate those writings about Shambhala. And that is a text that he started but never really finished, called The Golden Dot. Yeah. And that we have, but it leaves off in mid-sentence, and there's a lot left not written.
Okay, one last question.
I just want to let you know, in terms of Lama Ujin's dream, I was in the car with Khyentse Rinpoche and Lama Ujin, and it was like, okay, so Khyentse Rinpoche and Lama Ujin are going to JFK, and then about 2 minutes later, messenger comes up and says, hold it, that to communicate is that Trungpa Rinpoche wants Ujin to go to you guys. And I go, oh. And they say goodbye to each other in the back seat. He gets out, and then we walk Ujin away, and Khyentse Rinpoche goes to JFK.
Yep. Yeah.
It was.
So you were there.
I was there. I was there, and it was like, really? And that was the communique. And I said, amazing. And then, of course, in the poem, that Ujin wrote.
That's a poem that Khyentse Rinpoche wrote.
That Khyentse Rinpoche
about all
about
that.
Ujin is.
That's right.
It's in there.
Yep.
And so
Yeah.
you mentioned that.
Yeah. And Khyentse Rinpoche told Ujin something before he left.
What did he say?
And we didn't learn this for many years. But it wasn't easy for Ujin. A new language, a new culture. Ujin was not a monk, never had been a monk. So that part was not particularly an issue. But we weren't exactly the most inspiring of disciples. It was hard for Ujin. And there were times when it was like, I can't take this anymore. Yeah. And, Trungpa Rinpoche was very kind to Ujun. They had a very nice relationship. Every now and then, Rinpoche would ask me, so how's Ujun doing? And I would say, well, don't you know? And he said, oh, no, he'll never talk to me. I'm like an important person. He can't talk to me. He's going to talk to you. So at any rate, there were times when, Ujun was just about ready to leave. He even tried to leave once. But at some point, Ujun told us the following. He said that before Khyentse Rinpoche left, he said to me, Trungpa Rinpoche is a special Lama. We have a very special, very close connection. You're going to see things about Trungpa Rinpoche that you're probably not going to understand. He's an unusual person. You need to know that he has my 100% confidence and support, and that he is a pure Dharma person. There is nothing else going on. So, and he said, other lamas are going to ask you to help them with this, that, and the other thing. You are not allowed to help any of them out at all. You are here to serve Trungpa Rinpoche and no one else. That's pretty amazing.
Thank you. I want to thank Larry for being here, putting us on your schedule, and sharing your stories with us this evening. Thank you.
Wow, I love that. Amazing stories. We're really lucky to have this. That was Larry Mermelstein speaking with Joanna Rote at Sky Lake Shambhala Meditation Retreat in Rosendale, New York. That conversation was recorded in May 2024. Thanks to Joanna Rote for conducting the interview, Steve Gorn for providing audio equipment and assistance, and to Alex Simmons for audio editing. Check us out at thewisdomseat.org.